We have a great interview with Luke Savage. Luke Savage joins us to talk about his upcoming, well, actually his book has already been published and you can purchase it today. It's titled The Dead Center, Reflections on Liberalism and Democracy After the End of History. And you can purchase it over at orbooks.com, orbooks.com. Purchase it there rather than Amazon, you won't be sorry. Luke, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I wanted to kind of start off by laying the foundation of what your book is about, because in America, I think people get kind of confused with the phrase or the term liberalism. And what you're referring to when you mention liberalism in the title of your book is very different from, let's say, a liberal Democrat. So talk to me about what liberalism is in the context of your book, and then we'll move on from there.
Sure, yeah, well, I mean, I would say that in the context of my book, liberalism has both a very broad and a very specific meaning. So I definitely use the term in a way that will be, very familiar to, people watching, people listening, to refer to the kinds of politics, centrist politics that you might associate with something like, the modern Democratic Party. But I'm also I'm taking a longer view with it as well. The book, I think, is really a critique not only of something like the Democratic Party and other parties like it in 2022 or 2020, which is when much of the book was actually written, but also, the kind of political consensus, liberalism as it's been for the past 30 or 40 years. So the liberalism that follows and accommodates itself to Ronald Reagan in Britain, to Margaret Thatcher. That was kind of a counter-revolution that happened across the world more generally. Moved all of these liberal parties, but especially the Democratic Party, further to the right than they'd been before. So I think, very, very quickly anyway, very briefly, that's what I mean by liberalism when I use it in the book.
Right, so it's this notion that the economy is best suited to kind of follow this so-called free market ideology. I think neoliberalism is a good way of kind of thinking about it, right? And in a neoliberal society, government does have a role, and I always love to bring this up. It's just that the government's role is not to take care of its people. It's not to provide protection for its people. It's to work on behalf of corporations. So that's what the whole neoliberal ideology is really about. It's about free markets and serving corporate interests. And you're right. I mean, the Democratic Party has done a great job transitioning to that direction. And I think that transition has been complete. We've certainly noticed that during the pandemic, where literally 10 million Americans were laid off through no fault of their own. And they received, I mean, relatively speaking, relative to other countries that have a far more robust social safety net, very little help to make themselves whole during that pandemic.
That's right, and I mean, the pandemic is a really good case study, I think, for a lot of the things I'm arguing in the book. Because you would think, and I mean, I'm embarrassed to say, I kind of did think when the pandemic was starting, that an event like this would cause, even people as kind of stagnant in their thinking as America's liberals to rethink things in a more fundamental way. So maybe this is when finally the Democratic Party gets on board with single-payer healthcare. For example, could this be an occasion like cataclysmic events in the past? The Second World War comes to mind, where a whole new consensus is forged out of a crisis. And I think that in spite of a lot of kind of buzz about how the Biden administration is going to be this big radical thing, it's going to have kind of transformative ambitions, it's going to try to be like, it's going to try to do a modern New Deal, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue we haven't really seen anything like that out of the Biden administration. I mean, certainly not at the level of them actually delivering it. They have talked about some things which would be to the left of what Democrats have talked about in the past. I would argue, though, that they have not adopted anything like the kind of strategy that would be necessary to, achieve any of those things. And I think, I suspect we're going to see an even more conservative administration after the midterms, the midterms have concluded, than we did even in the first 2 years when we were hearing all about how radical Biden was going to be.
Yeah, let's stay on that point because I think it's a good one. And I have the same concerns because I really think that the Democratic Party is learning all the wrong lessons from the midterm election, right? Because the Biden administration came nowhere close to FDR-like policies to improve the economy and to stabilize people's personal finances and economic situation. However, while there was a lot of fear that his failure to deliver on those issues would lead to a red wave, a political bloodbath and all that, that didn't happen. And so I'm really concerned that they're gonna dig their heels in further, deeper, to continue on with this. No, most of the country is moderate and most of the country loves unaffordable health insurance and they love going bankrupt when they have health issues. And you know what I'm saying? Like, it's interesting that it works out that way.
There's a pretty incredible sleight of hand that you see from kind of Democratic spin doctors and media surrogates. People like James Carville, who there's one of my favorite essays in the book is actually about James Carville. I'll just drop that in here. But I mean, there's an incredible sleight of hand you see from these people after every election, which is that regardless of whatever the result is, it's always a vindication of this exact same strategy that they want to do every time, which is the Bill Clinton strategy, later kind of honed by Rahm Emanuel in ahead of the 2006 midterms. And it's basically the strategy they just did, which you could argue worked in 2018. The Democrats took back the House. You could argue that it worked this time. I mean, you could plausibly argue. I would have a lot of quibbles with that. But you can also think about all of the times it didn't work. I mean, it was basically the strategy the Democrats just pursued in the midterms was essentially the strategy that lost Hillary Clinton the presidency in 2016. Regardless of what the result is, you will always hear these people say that their strategy is correct. And when they fail, it's the left's fault, even when the left isn't in charge or steering the ship at all. So there's a remarkable sleight of hand here. It's whatever the result, they will always say the same thing because that's what the ideology they're signed up for believes.
Yeah, it is incredible that they blame the left or progressives anytime they lose elections, even though their strategy has been for the last, few decades actually, to just run as Republican light. But if you're running as Republican light against a Republican candidate, why wouldn't the constituents just go for the Republican candidate? Like, it makes no sense. But I have also noticed this other disconnect, Luke, that I wanted to ask you about. So when it comes to campaigning, when it comes to the promises that are just being doled out by these Democratic politicians, they're actually quite progressive. Canceling some portion of student loan debt. To be fair to Biden, he was never in favor of canceling all of it. But when it comes to health insurance, I mean, you think about campaign Obama versus President Obama, and it's night and day. So they get elected through pushing a progressive message on economic issues oftentimes. But then once they're elected, they do not deliver. And why is it that Democratic voters don't punish them more for that or hold them accountable for that? Because clearly they elected them to actually carry out the policies they claimed they would carry out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I think that the Democratic electorate, broadly speaking, is further to the left in many cases anyway, on many issues than your average Democratic Party politician, certainly to the left of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. As to why they're not punished, I mean, that's a pretty big question. I think that I think this is actually one of the big differences between the right in the United States and what calls itself the left in America, what's often, I think, erroneously called the left in America, which is that on the Republican side, I think the base often, no matter how kind of feral and like comical and absurd it is, the base tends to drive the agenda much more. And there are institutions on the right that facilitate that. And I would argue that there are exceptions to this, and I'm generalizing, but I think on the Democratic side, there's much more of a culture of deference. There's a culture of whatever Democratic politicians do is the best of all possible worlds. Whatever positions they stake out, that is by definition the furthest left, the most progressive position they can possibly do. And that's an argument that a lot of people find persuasive. I don't think it's true, but I think a lot of people find it persuasive, particularly as the Republican Party moves further and further to the right. and embrace. It's been especially true since Trump became the face of the Republican Party as well, but it was true before that as well. I mean, the kind of bogey scapegoat of the right, and the kind of the way that the political ecosystem is understood to just be this binary. And Democrats themselves are, by many people, not really understood to be participants in this. They're just dealing with, the rough weather of a country whose politics are defined by the right. I mean, that whole narrative, which I think a lot of people accept, is just wrong, because the Democrats have been part of the country's shift to the right as well. And you only have to look at the Clinton and Obama presidencies to see that.
I mean, just going back to the Clinton administration, I mean, I can understand the disdain American workers have toward the Clintons because of what Bill Clinton did when he was president. In these free trade deals that led to jobs being outsourced to other countries, with these corporations exploiting cheap labor, and of course incredibly abusive working conditions for these workers as well. And you see parts of this country, certainly the Rust Belt, just completely decimated as a result of that. So I can totally understand, the disdain people have for the Clintons and for what's currently transpiring economically for the ordinary worker. And I think that's also leading to workers starting to finally take matters into their own hands and organize. I'd like to see even more momentum on that front. But it's been really inspiring to see workers at Starbucks, for instance, tell Howard Schultz to kick rocks because they're gonna do a union vote and they're gonna demand that Starbucks recognize their union. It's wonderful to see that. But the other thing that I've kind of noticed that's been kind of frustrating about this is I think Americans are distracted, and I think they're distracted on purpose, right? So if they stop and think about what they're unhappy about in their lives, like what they would like to see improved materially in their lives, there's widespread agreement, right? Whether you're on the right or the left, people want to be made whole. They want financial stability. They want healthcare. I mean, it's not rocket science. But right now, the country, it always feels like the country's on the verge of civil war. And it feels like we're so polarized and we hate each other so much. When, to your point, both parties, the political class, there's a lot of similarity when it comes to economic policy. So I want to ask you, why do you think both Democrats and Republicans lean into culture war narratives so hard? Do you think that's part of the distraction? Do you think it's intentional? Or are these issues that they genuinely are, do you really think that Republicans are genuinely concerned about transgender athletes, which they can't even name a single one in their state oftentimes?
Well, to the last part of the question, I mean, yes, I think trans people make them very uncomfortable. And I think that the moral panics we see on the right around targeting trans people in particular, I certainly think that's genuine, but I don't think that's mutually exclusive with it also being a distraction. And I think a lot of what passes for debate between the two parties often is a distraction. And I think there's a very straightforward reason for that, which is that the two parties have converged on all kinds of fundamental questions. You go back, we were talking about the Clinton administration. I'm forgetting the name, it might have been Dick Morris, the Clinton advisor, who summed up that their approach, I think in 1996, by saying we're going to fast track the Gingrich agenda. I mean, that just tells you right there. And so when the two parties, have converged, but you still have this spectacle of democratic politics where you have to have disagreement because there are elections and there are campaigns. And of course, this is also generalizing. There are all kinds of fundamental questions in which liberals and conservatives still do disagree. But on a lot of these fundamental economic questions, issues where, as you said, healthcare is just the perfect example. I come back to it again and again. Poll after poll tells us that a majority of Americans feel one way, and yet you do not find that view reflected in the mainstream of either of the two major political parties. And that's because the leaderships of both parties are, barely responsible, if at all, to genuine democratic pressure or majority opinion. They're responsive to a permanent class of donors and other kinds of patrons I mean, like you said off the top, neoliberalism rewrites the state, not so that the state is rolled back, but so that it's rolled back in particular areas. And what remains is there to serve the corporate interests that have captured the state and want to, use it and rewrite policy for their own purposes and self-interest. And so I think that would be how I'd answer your question. I mean, the culture war is a reflection of the fact that the two parties have converged in all kinds of fundamental questions, and you have to have, people. There has to be content for cable news, so you got to have something to argue about.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and I do think that to some extent the culture wars offer an opportunity for these two parties that have really considerably like melded into one party on economic policy. We don't have many options when it comes to economic policy. The two parties have totally melded together due to unlimited campaign donations from corporate interests. So they differentiate themselves by debating about, the culture war stuff for sure. So final question for you. For the sincere left in the United States, right? I'm not talking about broadly the left. I'm talking about people who identify as democratic socialists or leftists. How do they navigate this? Because I can't help but think about Bernie Sanders 2016 versus Bernie Sanders 2020. There was a difference between those two campaigns. And I feel like because of the way he was treated by the press, by the Democratic establishment in 2016, he was kind of sucked into focusing some portion of his 2020 campaign on the social issues. Is that something, and when I say social, I specifically mean like the culture war narratives, right? He had to like dip his toe into it or else he'd be attacked pretty viciously. He was attacked anyway. But how do you navigate that in a way that doesn't take away from your economic messaging while also kind of covering your bases to make it abundantly clear that you do care about the social issues, doing something about discrimination, doing something about anti-transgender hatred in this country? How do you balance that all?
Well, I wish we had more time to get into the two Bernie campaigns. I mean, generally speaking, I think Bernie is very effective at this. I mean, I think that he is somebody who has, for a long time, staked out ground that is decidedly on the left when it comes to these big economic questions. But if you go back through his history, he also has a pretty impeccable record on all kinds of other stuff, which made it so ironic. The kinds of attacks that were directed at him, particularly by Clinton in 2016. So I think that, I guess we don't have much time here, but I guess I'll answer your question by saying I think that you lead with the things that a majority of people agree on, but you don't, you don't cast the other stuff away. Sometimes it's important for, you can't just chase majority opinion. Bernie Sanders is also somebody, and I think this can be expanded to apply to the left as a whole, right? It's not our job to always just look for a show of hands. Sometimes you do have to stake out positions that are held by a minority because you are trying to persuade people. But in terms of modern electoral politics or in terms of organizing your workplace, you focus on the fundamental questions that the points of shared self-interest on which everyone agrees. And even though Bernie was not successful in either of his presidential runs, I do think that there's a roadmap to be found in both of them for how we move forward if we ever get a chance to try something like that again.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. Well, Luke, thank you for being so generous with your time. Everyone go check out his book. It is a great one and you will enjoy it. I promise you that. I read it myself. The Dead Center: Reflections on Liberalism and Democracy After the End of History. Which, by the end of history, all right. And by the way, make sure you check that out over at orbooks.com. That's orbooks.com. You'd also check out Luke on his podcast, Michael and Us, and you could read his work over at Jacobin. Luke, thank you again.
Thanks so much, Anna.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.